It's my real pleasure to introduce two fantastic writers, Alma Katsu and Julia Fine. And I'll do it in this order because that's the way I wrote it. And then we'll open it up to hear about their books. I've known Alma Katsu for years, having first met her when we were both spies for the Ukraine. She's with the...
How did you know about that?
Yeah, she doesn't like to talk about it. In fact, she's not allowed to talk about it. But Alma worked for several years, let's put it that way, for top secret government agencies. And I won't mention their names, but one of them, the initials are, well, I can't even do that. But it begins with C and ends with A. And she may know the truth about certain dossiers, but we'll get to the Q&A. But more importantly than that, she's a real writer. She started studying at Brandeis, where she worked with John Irving, before going on to becoming a reporter in Boston. Before she went to work as a spy, she earned her MA, is that right? Do I have the order right? At Johns Hopkins Writing Program. And she came in from the cold, publishing her first novel, The Taker, which was book one of a trilogy. Publishers Weekly said she makes the supernatural seem possible, and the Taker trilogy and her new book, The Hunger, combines elements from many traditions, from horror to fantasy to suspense to chillers and thrillers. She's here today to talk about The Hunger. It's the story of the Donner Party with a devilish twist in it. Stephen King, that guy, Stephen King, you all know who that is. He said, what did he say? It's hard to put down. Not recommended reading after dark. But what does he know? You can read the book at night. It's perfectly fine. You won't be harmed in any way. In fact, that might be the best time to read it. R.L. Stine, who wrote the Goosebumps series, wrote after reading The Hunger, I swear I'm shivering still. Please welcome Alma Katsu. Do you want to go and then we'll do this? Or?
Oh, sure.
Okay.
So I'll just tell you a little bit about the book while I'm fresh in your mind. First of all, you're hysterical. And remind me somebody, and I'll tell you the story of the Stephen King tweet, because it happened while I was on the road, and it's kind of a funny story. But let me tell you about the book. So it's a reimagining of the Donner Party story. I think a lot of people feel like, if you went to school in the United States, you heard about the Donner Party, even if you didn't learn all the details. A group of settlers gets trapped in the mountains when, a horrible storm hits, and they're stuck up there, and they have to make some really, really difficult choices, shall we say, what you have to do to survive. But that's not the whole story. And what I found as I started researching it, what a really fascinating saga it was, what they went through. The real story started 1,400 miles earlier when this group of people, and there were about 100 people in the party that ended up getting stuck in the mountains, 7 families. What fueled their decision to make this trip? Because for some of us, not all of us, those of you with great imagination can probably already imagine what it must have been like to try to make that trip. It was a completely different experience than what almost anybody on Earth actually these days, can imagine. Just wilderness, aside from the Native American tribes that lived there, and it's not like it was a super dense populated area with them. Just wilderness, no communication. You were taking your life into your hands. What makes people decide to give up their farms, to give up everything they know, their families and friends, pack it all in a wagon, and go off in the company of strangers for months in the hopes that you're going to make it to the other side? And that's what the Donner Party story is about. Yep.
Oh, okay. Terrific. Now let me introduce Julia. I've known Julia Fine for about 15 minutes. But after reading her debut novel, What Should Be Wild, I feel as if we're somehow old friends because of the quality of her writing. Not only is she Julia Fine, but she's a fine writer. A recent graduate of the Columbia College in Chicago MFA program. Julia also had a great mentor, like Alma had John Irving. She has studied under Audrey Niffenegger, who the time traveler's wife, and who was also one of the first people to blurb my first novel. And so who doesn't love Audrey Niffenegger, if only for that? So over the course of years, they traveled through time together, Julia and Audrey, and the result is this book that we have before us that has been 10 days, since it was published 10 days ago, has just been popping up and exploding all over the literary scene. Let me tell you some of the places, if I can see these. A Barnes & Noble Discover Great New Writers Summer 2018 selection, a top May pick from everybody from Pop Sugar, whatever that is, to Southern Living, Book Riot, The Verge, Chicago Review of Books, Kirkus, Family Circle, Apartment Therapy, and the Washington Post. It's actually quite a remarkable book, and Julia's as well been publishing things on the internet. We were just talking about a little thing that happened the other day to me. Well, I'll bring myself into it. Why not? On LitHub. If you don't know LitHub, you should find out about it. Just go on the internet, LitHub. And I came across an article about, eight great curses?
Curses in literature, yeah.
8 great curses in literature, a list of 8 great curses. And I thought it was insults. I thought it was the 8 great. So I looked it up, I read the article, and I thought, no, this is actually more interesting than what I thought it was about. And so I shared it on my, Facebook and Twitter and all that stuff. And only later did I notice that it was written by Julia here. She lives in Chicago now, but she's originally from Maryland, just down the road. And to top everything, she has a 1-year-old. So if you can write a book and go on the road and have a 1-year-old, amen. Amen to you. So please tell us about your book.
So I guess the curses, 8 best curses in literature is a good introduction. What Should Be Wild is about a young girl who is born with either the gift or curse of being able to kill and revive things with her touch. So she kills her mother in utero and is sort of kept incubated until she's ready to come out into the world, at which point her father whisks her away and studies her, raising her beside a forest where women throughout the generations of her family women have gone missing throughout generations in her family in this mysterious forest next to her home. And so the plot really begins when Maisie, the protagonist, has to look for her father. He goes missing. She has to enter the woods and sort of come to terms with her own power, which is really, I'm using as a metaphor to talk about female desire and coming of age and puberty. So it's been called a feminist fairy tale. So I think it is sort of a dark feminist fairy tale about Maisie, the main character.
A dark feminist fairy tale. That's a great place to begin, actually. So let's talk a little bit about the Blakely family curse. It's not just Maisie, right, who has this particular gift, but there's this wonderful collection of other women throughout history that their stories are woven together with Maisie's story. You want to talk a little bit about that?
I think I'm using this right. So it's Maisie basically is the last in this line of women who, for whatever reason, have struggled to fit into society. And so one of her ancestors is in her late 30s, early 40s, still unmarried, and sort of has no prospects in the year 1600. One of them is sort of less attractive than her sisters, and her parents are sort of upset with her about that. One of them is a woman who enjoys sex in the year like 1200, which is, as we all know, it's a no-no. And so these are all women who sort of have these different desires and are unable to act on them because of the constraints of society. And so it's as Maisie sort of figures out how she can or cannot act on her own desires, we hear the stories of these women in her family. And I was really inspired by fairy tales and by both the way that women throughout history have been portrayed in fairy tales and folk tales, and also how they've used fairy tales and folk tales to sort of take back some of the power that's denied them. So when you think about, say, one of these characters goes back to 700 AD. She's in sort of pre-Roman Britain. And so looking at sort of just the long line of the way women from then till now have had to sort of take power in society, a way they've been able to do it is through storytelling and through sort of using stories to sort of circumvent. I'm rambling. I'm really sorry.
No.
So I think what I'm trying to say, so if you go back to like the Oracle at Delphi or sort of old wives' tales, these are ways that women have been able to make statements that they might not otherwise have been able to make, because it was really men who are in the position of power. It's men who are making decisions. But through storytelling, women have been able to sort of have a say. And so I was trying to do that in this book, explore both women who tell stories, the way stories are told about women, specifically the way sort of desire is discussed.
Yeah. It's really fascinating that you thought to sort of take typical women, right? The sisters. I mean, I think everyone on this panel has been very influenced by fairy tales and folk tales. I know Keith has been. But the thing I've always kind of resented about him a little bit is that the main character, the woman, is always like a princess. She's the most beautiful, whatever. She might be the youngest or but I think what you hit on is that you're representing really what most women are, right? We're not the prettiest one in the family or whatever, but we have our attributes, and our story deserves to be told too.
Exactly, yeah.
So talk a little bit about, in your book, about the question of desire, because that plays a prominent part in at least one of the storylines.
The female.
Yes, the female desire.
So the story is told from multiple points of view, because first of all, there was just so many really interesting characters in the Donner Party among those 100 people that were there. So we have like a few main narrators and a few minor ones as well. But one of the characters I decided to sort of pull out and bring to the forefront is Tamsin Donner, and she was the wife of George Donner, the ostensible lead of the party. And history is not kind to George, deservedly so. He probably shouldn't have been the leader of the party. He didn't know what he was doing, but he was one of these guys that just seems to feel that they deserve to be made a leader, even if they don't have the necessary. I probably shouldn't go there, being in Washington, D.C., but anyway, but his wife was far more capable, and history bears this out too. She had been, even though she was quite a bit younger than him, and she had been married before, lived in North Carolina, and she had been a school teacher when she was young. And she ended up coming west, a little farther west, to help her brother raise his family when his wife died. And all this is reflected in the book, by the way. But she had aspirations. She wanted to write a book about botany, and she used her time as they were making their way along the trail to gather flowers and try to sort of, codify and categorize all this. But I portray her, as often happens when you have very capable, smart women. Yes, she does have desires of her own. And she's a little unsatisfied with George, shall we say. And
We shall.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so oftentimes women, when they're in this predicament, get themselves in a little bit of trouble. But she also gets herself out of that trouble, and I think kind of learns through the experience. People have said they've really found Tamsin to be a very satisfying character in the book, and I'm pretty proud of that.
So let's get some equal time to the men in your books, because they are both books. There is that strong. There are strong women in both books, and much to be admired, and both as a written document, but also philosophically. But there are some men in this books who are, real jerks. Would you like to talk about some of the? And it's kind of facetious, but also they are kind of real jerks. But they also sort of become a trap for some of the characters, and the question of desire as a trap, and the men who pretend to be something they're not, was a real, as a male person, was interesting to me. So if you want to,
Well, men are complicated, aren't they? Men are complicated creatures. Well, the men in my books are complicated. You're probably thinking most of Charles Stanton, who's one of the main characters. He was a bachelor, one of the few bachelors in this wagon train, which was mostly made up of families. And as a bachelor, he was looked on, with a little suspicion. But he ends up, he's got a complicated past that he kind of hides, and he's haunted by demons. They sort of are driving him to, constantly sort of look to be somewhere else. But in the course of what happens in the book, he's sort of forced to confront that, to make a decision, and ends up being very heroic. And he's one of the ones that falls in with Tamsin. It's sort of natural that she would be attracted to someone like that, someone who's strong. She never really finds out the depths of his complicated past. But I do enjoy writing, having all the characters be complicated, right? Because we all are. No one's a one-trick pony, as they say. You're not all good. You're not all bad. You're not all about one thing. But we all have these a lot of different influences in our lives that pull us in different directions. And the challenge is, by the end of the day, hopefully you've learned to overcome your demons and to bring out the best in yourself.
Yeah, my book is mostly written from the first-person point of view of Maisie, who's a 16-year-old girl who has never met a boy in her life until she sort of has this experience where she meets two at the same time, and it's very overwhelming for her. She's sort of wrestling with, I think, some of the physical desires that all girls her age have, and she definitely makes some decisions that are purely sort of physical, motivated by physical desire. And I think as a reader, obviously I wrote the book, I know it's going to happen, but I hope that sort of people coming in from the outside can look at it and you can sort of tell that she's making choices that are probably not in her best interest, and that she's sort of following this path that is not going where she thinks that it's going. But it was important to me to show that, and I guess I was lucky because it's first person that I really only need to show these characters the way she sees them for the most part. There are one or two moments where I step outside and you get a glimpse of them from a more omniscient perspective. But because it's 16-year-old Maisie with this boy she thinks is attractive, I really had the luxury of portraying him the way he wanted to portray himself to her, and having the reader sort of discover along with Maisie what's actually going on, which it's hard to talk about without really sort of giving away plot points. But I think anyone who's ever been a teenage girl or known one can see that, the things he's saying to her are probably not what she thinks that they are. But it was important to me because I feel like at that age, with so little experience. That's sort of the way a lot of people have those experiences, specifically younger women, either because they don't know any better, or they're taught this is sort of what to expect from men, or this is what they really wish they could get from men. And so I think like she's, there are moments where it's just like you want to shake her because like you're being such an idiot. Clearly this is not the thing to do. But I think like anyone who's ever known a teenage girl, like that's how they are, and that's how you feel toward them. So.
Yeah, I can't think of a situation that might be more delicious to write than a 16-year-old girl who's never seen a boy before meeting two. I mean, really, that sounds like fun.
So we've lightly touched upon the question of sex here, but let's talk about violence. Because one of the remarkable things about both these books is when violence occurs in the book, and I don't want to scare anybody away from reading either of these two excellent books. I highly recommend them.
This is the Chills and Thrills panel, so you're...
Yes, but there's no... Do we have an M on our thing? Anyhow. What's my question about violence? I was really... It really jumps out at you. It jumped out at me. When you're coming along reading these stories, and then there's some moment of there's some moment of some unexpected shock to the story, and I'd like to hear what you think about as a writer.
It just dawned on me, but that's how we experience in real life, I think, unless you have a really effed up life. Chances are when something violent happens, it's a big surprise. So I will uncloak on one thing. As Keith alluded to, I did work in the intelligence business for a long time. And part of that time was as the senior most analyst for war crimes and atrocities. So I will bet you dollars to donuts that I have probably been exposed to more horrible things that men do to each other than you can imagine. And even then, it's still, when something violent happens, you're always in shock. It's not like you're expecting it and you're prepared for it. And so I think it's kind of natural that's what should happen in a book. I mean, when you're writing, violence should mean something. It should, jar you for a reason. And so, I mean, I do kind of pride myself a little bit on this book. There's no expected cannibalism scenes, right? It's not going to be your everyday cannibal. Just kidding. Yeah. There's actually like a lot less cannibalism than you would think with the Donner Party story.
Mine has more cannibalism than you'd think, so.
Yeah. Strangely.
It should have been the cannibalism panel.
Right.
I find more cannibalism in places. Since I wrote this book, people come to me and they're like, did you know this movie had cannibalism? No. Did you know this book had cannibalism? No. I don't feel so alone.
So we're doing all the taboos here.
Wow.
Cannibalism. So talk a little bit about your cannibalism experiences, Julia.
Oh, wow. It's funny. So I have a character in this book who I suppose is what put me on this Thrills and Chills panel, that everyone who reads, not everyone, but a lot of people have come to me and said, like, oh, this part is so scary and it's so creepy. And my mother-in-law apparently turned to my father-in-law like halfway through and was like, I think I'm a little scared of Julia now. But it's funny.
Good. That's a good thing.
That is a good thing.
Yes. She's lovely. But, but for me, it's funny because I don't see this character as, and I'm not sure if you feel the same way, I don't see this character as scary or sort of the decisions that she's making, even when it is cannibalism. To me, it's like there's a perfectly rational reason that she's doing this and she's acting on, like, so much of my book is sort of allegorical and it's about emotion and desire and sort of like taking what you want. And so it makes total sense. And she's my favorite character and I find her very inspiring and empowering. So I guess I can see why my mother-in-law is like, oh, you're scary. But I don't know. I think as long as it's not sort of excessive for the sake of being excessive, or gruesome for the sake of being gruesome, it's a really good trope. I don't know if you've read, there's a book called, I'm blanking, it's by Sabina Murray, called A Carnivore's Inquiry, and it's basically just about this woman who goes around the country eating her lovers, but then throughout she sort of has these little like historical vignettes about cannibalism throughout history. So she talks about the Donner Party. She talks about, I think there's like Captain Cook, there's a situation, but it's all over the world, all these different scenarios. And this was before I had written this book, actually. I was drawn to that book. I think you'd probably love it.
I'm going to have to read
Yeah,
it.
it's called A Carnivore's Inquiry.
I've heard of it. I didn't know.
Really great. I mean, she's a beautiful writer, too. But it's just interesting because it seems like people have such a visceral, immediate reaction to it. It's so taboo. It feels like you can use cannibalism to sort of get at certain emotions and feelings and ideas that maybe you can't get at without really just like jarring somebody.
Because it can be a metaphor for something. I'll say what you had said is like with your character, just to touch, remind folks, when you had talked about, the character has a reason for what they do. Same thing here, and by the end of the book, you find out the reason why people did certain things. As I said, for really the story begins before the journey ever starts for the wagon train, and you do learn the backstory of some of the major characters, and it kind of helps make everything sort of make sense. But one of the funny things I found when I went on tour, because right, you're the author, you know what's in the book, but a lot of times your audience, when they come to meet you, hasn't read the book yet, and so they don't know. And for some reason, I just kind of thought, people will know there's not a lot of cannibalism in this story. What was I thinking? It's the Donner Party. So some people would come, for the most part, I figured no one's going to want to talk about actual cannibalism. I mean, I had to do a fair amount of research, even though it's not really larded in the book. You'd be surprised what you have to know to write a book, right? But some people would show up and they would be disappointed if we didn't really get into it. Like they were all prepared with recipes and everything. They knew far more history than I. Yeah, right. When you go on book tour, you are exposed to parts of America that you didn't even know existed.
Yeah, absolutely. I don't disagree with you. I think both books had the right amount of cannibalism in them. Not too much and not too little. In fact, now I've got to write another book myself.
Yeah,
I'll have to add some cannibalism.
I do wonder, I know we had sort of via email communicated this idea that like women not necessarily can't write horror, but like aren't willing to go there or aren't sort of like marquee horror writers in a way that men are. And I wonder how much, I'm sure there's millions of cannibalism books that we don't know about because it was just like, it's just another male author writing cannibal. I don't know.
Yeah.
You just gave me a great idea for a blog post, actually.
No, I think that's an excellent question about, as women, do you feel different set of expectations?
Yes.
About
Yes. So
how much of a horror writer are you?
It kind of came up for me because I don't want to brag, but so this book has been called one of the best horror novels ever written by a woman.
Yeah.
Kind of an interesting compliment, right? But I'll take it. But I have thought about this a lot because my first books, the first 3 books, the Taker trilogy, aren't horror, but they were in that sort of supernatural. And believe me, some horrible things happen in them, but they weren't considered outright horror. But when you're first going out, you sort of court a lot of different audiences. And when you have a cross-genre book, that means you court the fantasy audience as well as the horror. And I kind of had my eyes opened. It was the horror community was very resistant. And I didn't know if it was because of the type of book I'd written or because I was a woman, because I noticed that a lot of places like the Horror Writers Convention, it's predominantly men, predominantly a certain kind of men. I hate the stereotype like that.
Cannibals.
Well, cannibals. But this time around, I will say they've been a lot more accepting. The horror community has really kind of opened their arms to me. But it has made me think. And a couple weekends ago, there was this kerfuffle on Twitter. I don't know if any of you guys are part of the horror community. If you are, you would have heard about it, where somebody brought up something that's actually was said before. That is, I don't know if he's a horror writer or a horror fan, was saying, well, women just can't even imagine the kind of terrible things that go on in a man's head. Again, former senior analyst for war crimes and atrocities. I want to meet that man, and we will shop. I mean, that's actually like a psychopathy. That's not that's what a crazy person thinks, right? But it made me think a lot about that question. Do women look at horror differently? And it's kind of a trenchant question because the horror film community has been looking at this. This past year, there's been a number of women directors of horror movies who've kind of broken out. The movie The Babadook was directed by a woman, and there were a few others. There's one called Raw, and I'm blanking, unfortunately. But they kind of grappled with the same question. And I do think that women's horror might be a little different. But there's men's horror that's different too, that goes for the same thing, and that is maybe less that visceral kind of just blood and fear of death horror, and more the fear of the other things that are more personal to us, that maybe are more horrible than this sort of fantastical crazy murder scene that probably isn't going to happen, but things like abandonment and losing your job and not being able to support you and your family. The Babadook, I don't know if anyone's seen that movie. If you haven't, you should. It's super good. Is about a single mother's fears, which felt so real to me, more real than like Halloween or something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, the Babadook is amazing. I would also highly recommend it. I feel I've been able to avoid sort of this. No one has really considered this a horror book. I think no one really has known how to classify.
Why don't they find out about the cannibals?
At all? I know. But I have gotten a lot of people who say sort of like, where should we shelve it? What genre is it? What type of book? Is it fantasy, but it doesn't really fulfill the tropes of fantasy? I guess it's magical realism. Is it literary fiction? What is it? And so I've been lucky that nobody says, like women can't write that kind of book, because I'm stuck with like, what kind of book is it? Like we haven't even moved past that, I guess. But yeah, I definitely think that women, because I pulled from fairy tales, and so many fairy tales about women are just already horror stories. Just when you look at, especially when you look at sort of some of the more original, like the Grimm brothers versions of stories where there's blood and gore and incest and rape and really terrible things happening all the time, it just reflects sort of the world that these people lived in as they told these stories. But it does seem like fairy tales and sort of princesses. Like you said before, you saw fairy tales, they're always princesses. And so it's this weird dichotomy of like a fairy tale is both a story about a princess, but also a story about like, cutting off your foot to fit into a glass slipper, or having to run away from like your father who wants to commit incest. Like there's just all these terrible things. And so to me, it's like that line between sort of women's knowledge and like sort of what women are writing about, and then these horror stories it's not really there. Like it's both the princess story and the incest story. And part of what I tried to explore in this book actually is sort of that double-edged sword. I have a character who she can kill and revive things with her touch. And so she's always walking that line between sort of fascination and disgust and sexuality in a sort of positive, like empowering, sexy way, and sexuality in a like, we're scared of women's bodies, let's burn the witch kind of way. And so I think sort of looking at women writing horror, it seems like such a perfect fit to me. I'm much more interested in horror written by women, I think.
Yeah, I can't wait to read this. It sounds great.
So let's talk a little bit about then. Okay, one last question, then we'll open it up to you all. Let's talk a little bit about then the sort of confluence of influences on both books. I mean, there's fantasy, there's fairy tale, there's horror, there's history. There's this great mashup of genres that sort of, you ask the question, where do you shelve it? Yeah. Well, you shelve it in the bookstore. I mean, you shelve it, it's a story. So do you wrestle with that question about where does your work fit in?
Gosh, yes.
Yeah.
I don't know how much. I find that most readers are fascinated by this question too, right? The how the sausage is made, because at the end of the day, all you want is a great story to read, and most great stories are some combination of various genres. I think very few excellent books are, strictly fit within one silo, like The Time Traveler's Wife. That's one of my favorite books, right? And I loved her Fearful Symmetry too. But those are great examples of books that aren't just one particular kind of book. But it does create a problem for the bookseller, because how do you convey something that's this sort of rich amalgam of things to readers who just want to get a good sense before they shell down their hard-earned money? Am I going to like this book? So this is probably a cleaner combination of genres than my previous 3 books, which were really like all kinds of things. The history in this is very strong. So if you like historical fiction, I think you'll enjoy the book. As a matter of fact, what's really been tickling is all of the reader comments back to me that say, after I read your book, I was motivated to go and learn about the Donner Party because I want to find out what's fact and what's fiction. And there's a lot of fact in there. I literally say there's like 10,000 facts. It was a lot of research, but I like research. And then the horror part, which to me is kind of light. And then Stephen King said that deeply, deeply disturbing thing, and I'm like, really? Yeah, that's all hyperbole. It's not that disturbing, right, Keith?
No.
So it's interesting, but and it's baffling though, and I'm sure you're finding the same thing, because in some ways it seems like exactly that kind of mix that most readers enjoy, and certainly in popular entertainment today, movies and TV, that it fits that niche. But for some reason, it does make it hard sometimes for readers to find your book.
Yeah, I sort of what you're saying about how there's only a little bit of horror in it. For me, the scariest books are the books that just have sort of that little glimpse, and then you go back because you just never know when it's coming, and it feels more real. But yeah, while I was writing, I was not focused at all on where the book would go. Part of it is Audrey Niffenegger was a teacher and mentor to me, and she really is sort of defies genre. It's like speculative fiction, I guess, but she sort of is just writing what she wants to be reading. And so I thought, I'm just going to write what I want to be reading. And I like fairy tales, and I like horror, and I like magical realism and feminism. And so I sort of just took all of my interests, and then I targeted my reading. For the historical sections, I definitely did historical research, and my sense is that you just like looked through, like wagon train logs or various, like actual historical documents. And I was not quite as in it for that, but I read a lot of, no wagon trains. But I read a lot of like Shirley Jackson and Angela Carter and writers whose books I've always loved. And I said, I want to write sort of the kind of book that maybe they would want to read in 2018. And I want to take sort of some of the themes that they're talking about and some of the ways that they use language. And so I guess, like you would say, Shirley Jackson is horror, Angela Carter's magical realism, but it's not. I don't know if sort of genre has become more defined now. But yeah, all this to say that I really didn't really care all that much until it was time to sort of sell the book, and the publisher said, like, okay, well, what is this? But beforehand, I don't know. While writing, it doesn't seem to be that much of a concern, although it sounds like for you with your earlier one.
Yeah. Keep it up. Don't ever care about that question. Do we have any questions from the audience?
Cannibalism questions.
We're experts.
I can tell you how to cut up a body really efficiently.
Scared him off.
Yeah, I keep forgetting that most people don't want to hear that kind of thing. Sorry. No questions.
Yes.
I want to hear the Stephen King story.
She wants to hear the Stephen King story.
So this is fun. But it does make me feel like I'm bragging a little bit. Anyway, the night it happened, because I never thought that this would happen to me, first of all. To have Stephen King say something about your book is like, getting the golden ticket, right? Willy Wonka's golden ticket. And I was out on tour, which is not something that happens a lot these days with books, right? So I was lucky enough to be on tour, and for some crazy reason, I was at Poison Pen, doing Poison Pen Bookstore, and I was appearing with Brad Meltzer, #1 New York Times bestselling. Like, he gets on the list before his book even comes out, Brad Meltzer, and he's a super nice guy.
I hate him.
And I don't know how it happened that I was going to be there with them, but I'll take it, right? His 100 fans are going to show up. That's good. So I'm at the hotel, and they put you up at this hotel that's like a 2-minute walk from the bookstore. And I'm doing my makeup in the mirror when my phone starts going off behind me. No one ever calls me. No one except my husband. And I'm thinking, I'm in Arizona. Why is he calling me? Like, he needs to know where the milk is or something. So I almost don't go to the phone. But it's going. And so I look at it. And, like, all my friends are texting me, Stephen King just tweeted your book. I mean, I briefed the President of the United States, right? I have not felt this way. I was just like, ugh. Somehow I made it to the bookstore. I, opened my eyes, and there I was. I don't know how that happened. And there's Brad Meltzer. And I said, Stephen King just tweeted my book. And he takes the phone out of my hand, and he stands before his audience, and he reads it off to them. And he's like, wow. He was so generous. But, that is a night that is never going to be reproduced.
Yeah. He's a good, Brad is a good guy.
He is a wicked good guy. Was that worth it? Okay.
Yes.
And I did get to email back and forth with Stephen King afterwards, and just... it just makes you think, here's one person that with a few tweets can change the course of a person's life. It did change the trajectory of this book. Again, not to brag, but I have to so Ridley Scott bought the film rights to this before the book was even written. I mean, we have been so lucky, and it did hit a lot of top 10 lists and all that fun stuff. But when Stephen King tweets your book, things go crazy. It's amazing.
Way to go. Any more questions?
Oh, come on. I know you want to ask the cannibalism questions.
Yes.
How do you cut up a body?
How do you cut up a body?
So from the research I did, it's actually if you've ever cooked a chicken and you have to break down a chicken, it's the same way. It's along the joints. But for some weird reason, they usually go for the liver and the brains first. I'm not exactly sure why. Someone at an event hypothesized it's because that's fatty, and if you're starving, you want to eat the fatty parts first. I don't know, but yeah.
Are you happy now?
Helpful? Anything else? That's usually a conversation killer, yes, I admit it.
No?
Anything else?
Well, let's then see if I have any more questions. Yes.
Just about the backstories of the characters. How did you get that information? And was it all real or conjecture?
So, it was really interesting because I'm not, if someone had said to me, pick an era in history to write about, I would not have said the American West during Manifest Destiny, right? So it was kind of new to me. It is amazing how much research material is out there, both primary, secondary, and tertiary. And the other thing I found very interesting is how much of it lies and contradicts one another. But so there was a ton of material actually on the Donner Party, on a lot of amateur or, hobbyist historians and genealogists, a lot of documentation, and then when you start cross-referencing it, you find out that some of it's kind of shaky. So it gives you, an opportunity to take a story and embellish on it, and I think that's what makes the people wonder, because they'll have heard this bit, and then I just tweaked it a little bit, and they're like, whoa, so what's true, what's false? And it makes, for this interesting guessing game. But, yeah, it's amazing how much information. I found out the name of Tamsin Donner's first husband's, what his name was and what he did and how he died and all this crazy stuff. Can you imagine in 170 years somebody's going to be looking that stuff up about you? Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, mine?
Where?
So a lot of the research that I did was into sort of Western European fairy tales and folktale traditions, and so it seemed to make sense to set it there. So the book is set in northern England and the history of the Blakely family, which goes back, like I said, to sort of pre-Roman Britain, is all based on the history of the UK and women in the UK specifically. However, I was told pretty early on in the writing process that the type of like old growth fairy tale forest I was going for no longer exists in the UK. And so I invented my own village, my own forest, my own little sort of area, which, because it was already speculative magical realism, didn't seem like that much of a stretch. But it is sort of in a pseudo Britain in like 2010, 2015.
So let's close by talking a little bit about the sort of supernatural elements. I mean, we talked a little more about this. I don't want to give anything away. Don't look at me like that. Just because we were spies together doesn't mean you can look at me like that. The supernatural elements to both books, that they're kind of these great characters, and I wish we could figure out a way to talk about them without giving them away.
Yes.
But they're just this element that takes a coming-of-age story and intensifies it in this really vivid way, and takes this historical, factual story and intensifies it. And so maybe we could talk about what was your decision process in choosing to go that route and choosing the supernatural?
So, yeah, a couple things. A lot of people go, the Donner Party isn't horrible enough that you had to, introduce this horror element. And it came up in the research process because it's amazing how many really insanely horrible things happen to these people along the way. And after a while, you just start thinking, and they're not even all in the book. There was a lot more of the history in the book, and the editor said, a little bleak goes a long way. So we cut out some of the crazy deaths and killings that actually happened. But it made me think, boy, these people were cursed. What if they were cursed? What if something evil was falling? But really, the point of the book is that, there's the potential to be a monster inside each person. And under what circumstances does that monster come out? I mean, if you kind of think about what they were faced with, you're trapped in the mountains, not just yourself, but with your entire family. You're all going to starve to death unless you make this really difficult choice. Some people might think somebody who eats another human being is a monster, but under what circumstances does that monster come out? And of course, the horror element is a little bit bigger than that in this book. We have these external forces, and we do have sort of the question. It's a question, it's not a that makes you wonder really what is going on here. Is there something extra happening? And if so, where is it coming from? That I think just sort of helps build the suspense and the tension in the book.
Yeah, I think for me, bringing in supernatural elements and speculative elements really does just help sort of heighten the situation and enhance some of the circumstances that we all go through anyway. But when you hold up this supernatural element or this power that this young girl has, everything is just magnified. And I think it also helps, just like I said, maybe cannibalism is a way in to talk about some ideas or sort of approach certain things that are tough to just face directly. I think that for me, the speculative elements were a way to talk about women's bodies and women's self-esteem and empowerment without hopefully feeling too preachy. And it was sort of a way into that conversation that I hadn't seen done before.
Well, we've run out of time, but I want to thank Alma and Julia for a wonderful discussion about cannibalism and other matters. Thank you all for coming, and please give them a round of applause.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.